Welcome to today's episode of the Transcendent Minds podcast. And in this episode, we are going to embark on a journey into the realm of somatic exploration, resilience training, and the profound wisdom of the body-mind connection. I'm really thrilled to introduce our guest, Ginny Hoyt, a distinguished somatic practitioner whose insights and expertise are poised to enlighten and inspire. In our conversation with Ginny, we delve into the transformative power of resilience training, exploring practices such as cold plunges, yoga, breathwork, and sauna sessions. Through Ginny's guidance, we unravel the intricate ways in which these practices not only strengthen our physical bodies, but also cultivate emotional resilience and mental fortitude. As we navigate the depths of somatic healing and self-discovery, Ginny shares her profound insights on building a somatic foundation, navigating triggers, and exploring core wounds. Through reflective questioning and compassionate inquiry, we uncover the hidden stories and patterns that shape our experiences, paving the way for profound growth and transformation. Now we've heard about your impressive background, Ginny, would you mind taking a moment to introduce yourself from your perspective?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here to dive into this conversation with you today. I feel like you always give the best introductions. I love hearing your reflections of how you see what it is that I have to share. My name is Ginny Hoyt. I am a somatic practitioner. I'm a huge nerd, a huge lover of all things diving into body awareness, body experiences, and helping people make sense of what is going on in their internal world that ends up being reflected in how they present themselves externally, helping people get themselves more on track and being able to show the external world the person that they know that they have the potential to be internally, bringing in that alignment and letting that true sense of self come forward.
Beautiful. Building a somatic foundation is like constructing a sturdy structure upon which we can navigate life's ebbs and flows with grace and resilience. At the core of this foundation lies the cultivation of presence, a state of heightened awareness and attunement to the present moment. As we embark on this journey of self-discovery and transformation, we harness the power of presence to navigate the space between stimulus and response, thereby reclaiming our sense of free will and autonomy and shaping our agency. The space between stimulus and response encapsulates the essence of presence, highlighting the profound potential inherent in the pause, in the momentary gap between external triggers and our subsequent reactions. Was there a pivotal moment when you experienced the power of presence in navigating a challenging situation, and how did it transform your response?
That quote of presence being the moment between stimulus and response, to me, is a clear encapsulation of what it means to develop a presence practice. And it's something that I think is easily for people to take a look at their own lives and see how closely we do evolve to have no space in between stimulus and response, that we are just learn to be very reactive, right? Something happens to me, I'm responding right away without too much time to consider the long-term effects of my actions and how that's all going to play out. But cultivating this presence practice of giving yourself space to invite in awareness and a little bit more consideration of what do I want in this moment? How do I want to be showing up? What's actually going on? Are my knee-jerk responses even warranted in this moment? Or can I de-escalate the situation and show myself that I'm actually okay and I do have capacity to show up in something that feels more representative of the person that I am when I do feel confident that things are all well and fine. I do have an example of one of the first times that cultivating my presence practice really shined through for me. And it's somewhat of a funny example because it's rather simple, but the impression I was left with it was very profound. So, Peter, I live in Hawaii. I love how quiet, how slow the pace of life is here. That's a huge part of the reason why I moved out here. I'm from the East Coast originally, and the hustle and bustle was not for me. So coming out here and enjoying that slow pace of living feels really good to me. However, when you drive into Honolulu, that slow pace of living, it doesn't really feel as present there. Honolulu has a city-like energy. There is hustle and bustle. There is a lot of movement and commotion and things going on. So I do remember that there was one day I was driving through Honolulu trying to find a particular building that was in the downtown area. I could not find any parking. I was driving by myself. I was in the city. I didn't really know where I was, and there was a lot of stimulus around me that I could feel was causing me to get more tense. I could feel the anxiety building up of I don't really know where I'm going and I can't find any parking. My GPS just keeps refreshing and sending me around the block, all these one-way streets, and trying to watch all the lights and the signs. It was a lot. I noticed myself starting to feel really angry about it. I'm just so frustrated. I cannot figure this out. Then had that moment of my presence coming in, and I asked myself, what is it that you're really angry about in this moment? The answer that came to me when I sat with myself is things aren't going the way that I want them to. And realizing how young and how almost childlike that response felt, it had like a stomping of the feet type of energy of like, things aren't going how I want them to go. And having a temper tantrum about it made me laugh in that moment and popped the illusion that my frustration, my irritation, my anger was necessary in this experience. That Honolulu does not owe me an open parking spot on the day that I choose to go in there and try to find where I'm going to go. These things happen. It's nobody's fault. It didn't warrant me being angry and frustrated. Things simply weren't going the way that I expected them to. And that happens. Turning the situation on its head like that and realizing I'm being a little childish right now and I'm totally fine. This isn't an insolvable problem. I can handle this with holding the energy of openness and lightness. I did not need to clench as hard as I was. Showed me how impactful this presence practice can be, that I was able to turn my attitude around 180 degrees simply because I had the capacity to ask myself to gain more clarity on what was actually going on in that situation. Even though it is like a lighthearted example of being stuck in traffic, the emotional lasting impact that left me with was something that was the first time I had experienced something with that much reverence of how important I felt like cultivating presence was, that has carried me through. It's been years since of honing in on how important this is to me and something that I see benefiting me in the long term to cultivate and practice and work with and continue to show up to, even when it does feel hard. And I feel convinced that my frustration and anger can be legitimate, and the stories of why I think I'm justified to have the emotions, the responses that I do, that I am completely right in the stories that I'm telling myself about how things are the way they are. I'm just proven again and again that it's not always necessary. It says a lot more about me than it does the external situation, the ways that I choose to show up to them.
Many people can resonate with that. I know I can resonate with that frustration. Whilst it's a simple example, it's profound in another way, because it's not so much what you come up against, it's how you measure and present yourself to what you come up against, how you respond to what you come up against, not react. That phrase between stimulus and response is often associated with Viktor Frankl, who's an Austrian neurologist, psychiatrist. He was a Holocaust survivor and the author of the book Man's Search for Meaning. From memory, in his book, he discusses the idea that between stimulus or external events or circumstances, like driving into Honolulu, and response, our reaction or behavior, therein lies our power to choose. You went into your internal GPS and, oh, hang on a second, how am I responding to this? Whilst Viktor Frankl may have not used the exact phrase verbatim between stimulus and response in his work, the idea encapsulates one of the central themes of his teachings, because within that sacred space, you had the ability to reclaim your power, to choose your response rather than react impulsively based on what I call repetitious slavery. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is the packages and conditioning and past experiences and patterns that we have, and they repeat. We're a slave to them. We worship them even unconsciously. In essence, the presence that you experienced gave you the freedom to respond to that challenge with clarity, with intention, and with authenticity. Beautiful.
Thank you so much. That is definitely an experience that left a big impact on me of feeling into how much inviting in that little bit of space, asking that question of what's really going on right now opened up so much to me that I hadn't even realized how reactive I had been to that situation prior to asking that question. And I think that always an advocate for self-compassion here, that there wasn't so much judgment for myself for having responded that way initially. I do think it makes a lot of sense that if you're overwhelmed in a situation of a lot of things that are new and confusing to you, to meet it with some frustration of I don't understand, that is a logical response. There wasn't any judgment towards myself about having had that to begin with. But once the awareness was online of you don't have to choose that, felt like permission slip of thank God, because I don't want to be harboring that emotion. It was really uncomfortable and it could tell it was not helping me in any capacity to be holding that. But inviting in that spaciousness, just asking that simple question of what is really going on right now, and taking that 30-foot distance away and looking down on myself and seeing like, how are you really showing up in this moment that invites that little bit of space? And it doesn't need to be a lot. It's just that little bit of pause to invite in some awareness of let me get some clarity right now. If I can tell that I'm not showing up the way that I want to, I don't want to be feeling this overwhelmed and this frustrated, as my cue for, okay, I can tell that something needs to be addressed. Let me take a step back and figure out what exactly that is and how I can show up for myself. Coming back to that, making that the simple practice of how do I get to show up for myself? Coming back to that always as the question to ask, how do I get to take care of myself in this moment? It's really a beautiful self-love practice to come back to that has served me incredibly well in getting to not only know myself at a better level, but help myself evolve closer into the person that I feel really proud to embody on my day-to-day living.
What you're highlighting may seem a very simple thing, but really there is such a profundity within it because the ability to distinguish between reacting impulsively to stimuli or responding mindfully with presence. That's a muscle. You mentioned the word practice. It takes practice amidst the busyness and distractions of modern society. What are some effective techniques or practices would you advocate for cultivating presence in everyday life?
I would say that there are two routes you can use to go about approaching this problem. And I think that a little bit of both is the best option, in my opinion. The first one being is that there are physical practices you can do that involve getting your body into slightly uncomfortable situations to help teach your nervous system that I can experience safety in discomfort, and turning on that switch into your nervous system if I'm aware I'm going to jump in where I feel like I need to isn't always going to be necessary when discomfort is present. So what does that look like? These are things like cold plunge, sauna, yoga, things that are physically slightly discomfortable for the body. I personally love yoga and cold plunge. These are two of the practices that I utilize. These are things that you've had experience with, and you might know what I'm talking about when I say that the initial getting into the cold plunge or holding that pose for the first couple of seconds that really is pushing your capacity, you're feeling it. And there's a part of your mind that comes online that's get me out of this. I do not want to be here. You're cultivating this muscle of presence. Even though it's uncomfortable, I'm not dropping out of the pose
Mm.
or hopping out of the cold plunge. I can hear the voice of discomfort. I can hear and acknowledge, yes, it is uncomfortable. I can hear this voice. It's present. It's not going anywhere. But this is where I want to be. This is where I want to stay. It's an interesting transition that happens. That voice of discomfort does eventually settle down and recognize oh, nothing bad is happening. Everything is okay. This cold water isn't going to kill me. This yoga pose isn't going to rip apart my hamstring, that we are physically fine. Okay, maybe I don't need to be here anymore. And it does quiet down and fade into the distance. That is the practice of inviting in that presence, of teaching the body that in discomfort, I can be okay. I can acknowledge that, and it makes sense that it's there. It doesn't have to be enough of a reason for me to jump into my reactivity. I can hold that and stay where I am. Yeah, I would say cold plunge, sauna, these things that are like pushing the body into slight physical discomfort that you can hold space in is one way that you can go about it. These are practices that are really great for strengthening vagal tone. That is the switch between jumping into parasympathetic to the sympathetic nervous state, and it's teaching the body it might want to jump really quick into this isn't okay and we need to do something about it and we need to get out of here. But it's strengthening that vagal nerve that we don't have to, that this is safer than what my body has previously determined to be safe. Turning on that switch isn't necessary in this space, and it helps give the body a better range of understanding what is actually a situation it needs to be online for and what are things that are uncomfortable but they're okay. That translates into daily life, the skill that you get to apply when you're out in the world, having that better range of understanding what is not okay for me to be in versus what is, it's okay, it might be uncomfortable, but it's still okay, without jumping into that space of reactivity. You get to hone in that presence that you've cultivated for yourself by sitting in that discomfort. Finding a practice that resonates with you in that space is really important, working that physical muscle. And the other route is sinking a little bit more into the introspective side, which can look like what I had explained in my example, where you are making a conscious effort to look back on your prior experiences. Maybe if you're looking at everything that happened yesterday or the last week, and making note of areas where you can see places that you had jumped into your reactivity. That can look like situations where you notice that you were holding a big emotional charge, whether that is frustration, anger, resentment, feeling like you have a lot inside that you felt was bubbling up, things where you felt it was there and then you lashed out and unleashed it on another person or that situation. Those heightened states of emotional charge are usually a good indicator of where we have jumped into our reactivity, where we got lost in the story of what we're telling ourselves about what's happening, rather than having held the presence to what's actually going on, which is usually a much more de-escalated version of the stories that we like to tell ourselves about what we think is happening. So making that conscious effort to go through and replay, okay, where are some situations that I noticed that I wasn't responding in the way that felt best to me, that I was having a lot of emotion towards, and creating some kind of a map of, okay, what do all of these situations have in common? What are some parallels I'm noticing about the ways that I tend to respond to these types of situations? What do the types of situations have in common so I can carry it into the future and have some awareness of, oh, this situation I'm in presently is starting to take form to something I experienced a couple weeks ago that I know I had trouble responding to in a way that I was proud of. I know this looks familiar because I've taken the time to clarify to myself what things tend to set me off, or what are the behaviors I tend to embody when I've lost presence, so that it's easier to recognize them when you are in the present moment of, I have been here before, this is familiar to me, what am I going to do about it now? That creates space for change and helps detach from the stories of conviction we have about the way that we think these things are evolving, the stories that we're telling ourselves about exactly how the situation is, and this person is definitely wrong and they are definitely the ones who owe me an apology, or whatever the story is. That helps you detach and take a step back and realize maybe things aren't exactly the way I'm convinced they are, and my emotional charge might not be entirely necessary in this moment to react that way.
You brought up many things, but one of the things I want to take from what you've spoken about is free will, because the question is, how does the concept of free will intersect with the practice of presence? Do you believe we can exercise true autonomy in our response to life's challenges?
Yeah, geez, the free will Debate is a big one to open up, open a can of worms on. And I can't say that I have a definitive answer at the bottom of the barrel for how that all plays out. It's definitely one that I find really interesting to play around
Mm.
with and think about.
We're all taught we have free will, but do we have free will? And what is the rationality behind free will? It's probably a little bit of a philosophical question to ask rather than a straightforward question. It's sparked by what you spoke about because it bring into the whole arena the concept of free will and how that intersects with the practice of real presence. Do we have free will and presence? Can we exercise a sense or a true autonomy in our response to life's challenges? Or are we prisoners of the past? Or are we going to be pioneers of the future? For our own responses, what role does self awareness play in the cultivation of presence and resilience? How can individuals start to deepen their understanding of their patterns and their reactions?
Yeah, I think self-awareness and free will hold hands with each other somewhat in the sense of how much can you hold someone responsible for the amount that they have cultivated. I think self-awareness is key in making your way down this path. And I find it so interesting though, because my relationship with self awareness stemmed from a place of so much suffering that I felt like I hit a block where I had no other
Ah,
choice but to turn my awareness into myself and look at what is it that I'm doing. I found myself in repetitive situations that happened to me enough times. And I think this specifically related initially with people pleasing, where I noticed myself sitting in conversations agreeing with things that I knew I didn't actually agree with just for the sake of fitting in the conversation. So frustrated at how helpless I felt in those moments of I just had this impulse to go along and agree. And internally, I'm like, you don't even believe this. Why are you saying this? Like, it was so conflicting internally and not understanding, like, why do I feel like I have such a hard time expressing myself authentically? Looking around, I could see there were other people who could disagree. It wasn't received poorly. People were fine with it. But to me, I could see that and it almost didn't matter. Oh, they can do it, but I can't do it. There was a big sense of helplessness there. I don't understand why I'm having such a hard time expressing authentically. And it built up so much frustration for me. Eventually, I did have to turn that awareness into myself and see what is it that I'm bringing to the table that's causing this pattern to happen, because it happened so many times it really did not make sense anymore for me to continually point the finger at other people. The story that I had was like other people aren't making me feel comfortable enough to share how I think authentically. But that was happening so often that I was like, I don't really think I can blame everybody for having this problem and realize this is entirely about me and it's nobody's responsibility to make me feel comfortable. But the interesting part is what made me have that turning point? What force caused me to have that reflective, I can't keep blaming other people? It didn't feel like something I was so consciously choosing. It seemed to have just happened to me. There are people who have suffered tremendously more than I ever have who never get to that point of turning into themselves and looking inwardly. I don't really know what is that point for people to make that switch to start cultivating their self awareness. To me, it does feel like it's something outside of yourself that it drops into you to start practicing awareness. That I think ties into that free will point of, are we just a product of our conditioning or do we have the autonomy to take our lives in any direction we want? I do feel like there's somewhat of a force at play that stems from outside of ourselves, that we just receive it. I think does some of that directional guiding, because you can't, I'm sure you very well know, Peter, if you're on this path of self awareness and cultivating a presence practice, you can't force it on other people. You can teach as much as you want and show all of these examples and give them all the books to read, but you can't force that to awaken in another person. And they can suffer, they can go through so much, perhaps even more than you did before you made that turning point for yourself. It doesn't come online for everyone at the same time at the same pace. Yeah, cultivating self awareness, I think, is critical, but it does seem to happen in its own time at its own pace. I will say, though, if whoever is in the audience for listening to this, if you are here, you're probably on that path of wanting to dive into this and look into yourself and sort out what are all the things that we bring to the table that cultivate our experience. It's a really interesting conversation as we relate to other people that I know for me, I definitely went through a period of intense frustration once I realized how changeable things were for me and the way I related to the world. I really could upgrade and up-level a lot of things about myself. And of course, I wanted to share that with everybody that I love. You don't have to live this way, shaking them by the shoulders type of thing, wanting to give that gift to them, liberating them from their suffering. There was a lot of frustration there of like, why won't you listen to me? It felt like they were choosing to stay in their suffering. And I don't necessarily think that's the case anymore. It's certainly not something I can force to be inspired in other people. I don't think that point in someone's life is something they can control when it happens either. Everyone's on their own timeline with that type of turning point of choosing to look at themselves and take responsibility of how they're showing up and how their life reflects the energy they're holding towards it.
I agree. You brought up a lot of points there, and I know that you cannot force it upon anybody. I never try to force my beliefs or what I viscerally experience is my experience. It may not pertain to anybody else's experience. And if you see them as suffering or they haven't developed self awareness in themselves, you cannot organize and propel them into a situation by just telling them. They've got to experience it for themselves. That's when it sticks. That's when there's a sustainability to it. When people talk about transformation, people have to experience it themselves. Because if they don't, there is no sustainability. There are no metrics for it in terms of them having that visceral experience. Any belief is going to access a potential in you, and that potential will initiate certain actions which will produce results. And those results will either reinforce or reshape your belief system. It
Mhm.
depends on where you stand and how you look at it and what kind of awareness you want to develop in yourself. Interesting point you brought up. Could you discuss the relationship between mindfulness practices and somatic awareness, but in the context of building a strong foundation for resilience?
Yeah, definitely. Mindfulness and somatics, they go hand in hand. These practices you can do of putting your body in these somewhat uncomfortable situations and teaching it that it can still be okay, create space to invite in more mindfulness. Your mind isn't going anywhere. It has a lot of beautiful intelligence to offer. Ram Dass has a beautiful quote about the mind being a wonderful slave, but a terrible master.
Mm,
That you want it to work for you, but if you leave it in charge, it'll run you ragged. It'll convince you of all
absolutely.
sorts of things and inspire a tremendous amount of suffering for you. Developing mindfulness presence practice does put the mind back in the place that it was always meant to be, which was to be one that is like a voice to the side, one that it's letting you know, here are things I think you should be aware of. This might be dangerous. This might go wrong. Letting those things come online for you so that your sense of presence and centeredness can say, okay, I hear you. Thank you for letting me be aware that things might happen. Here's what I'm going to choose moving forward. I'm still going to continue moving forward in the way that feels best aligned for me with these things in mind, without this sense of a mindfulness practice or a presence practice where the mind is central to our experience. These voices of you better watch out for this and you better watch out for that becomes all that we can see through. That is the filter that we're living through. And so the conviction we have of these warnings being true feels like I must respond to them now because it is
Mm,
certain that they're happening. That is what inspires a lot of suffering and causes us to act from a place that maybe not be best representative of the people that we want to be, where we just become really reactive and fall into these responses that we don't love about ourselves, which was certainly the case for me with the people pleasing example. It was a story of if you disagree with them, they're not going to like you anymore. That human connection of wanting to be part of a group, to be included, and that fear of isolation being something that way back when held a lot of emotional charge of you better not let yourself be isolated because that's going to be the end of you. Even though I was sitting in a lunchroom with a bunch of coworkers and my isolation wasn't going to kill me, to my nervous system, it very much felt like it was. It felt you better not let yourself get kicked out of this group. We're going to agree with everything they say to give nobody a reason to dislike you. How much does that really work anyway? I had a pretty good laugh about that in retrospect of being like, what type of personality was I showing to have agreed with absolutely everything people had to say? Not the most fun person to talk to, I don't think. So did it even really get my needs met? Did I really even make myself likable? I don't think so, but it also left me with a lot of internal resentment that I spoke to earlier. I didn't even like the person I was presenting myself to be by playing out those stories. But I had so much conviction that I had to show up that way. That was causing me to fall into these patterns of behavior that I wasn't proud of and I didn't like. Making sense of what my body feels, these stories that my mind is telling me that can help me put that sense of center, that presence back in the driver's seat. That's where we want to be spending most of our day, is in that space of the witness, the observer. I can take these signals, this information, and I'm going to value it, but I'm not going to let it color my entire experience. That is not what gets to be in the driver's seat anymore. I get to make more resourced decisions from now on, ones that feel good and more supportive, only because I've worked up to the space of learning how to meet my emotional needs and made sense of why I previously showed up the ways that I did. That helped the mind and the ego kind of relax. She's got it. She hears what we have to say, and we don't have to be the ones who are driving the bus anymore. That there is a sense of self-trust that she can hear what it is that we want to share. She takes us seriously. So I don't need to be in charge because you've got this now. That, yeah, it's a big shift. And it's like you mentioned earlier, that is a muscle. For as long as I've been practicing this myself, it's not something that I sit in all of the time. And I find myself quite often having fallen into stories and patterns of things that I'm not proud of. And only in retrospect, you can be like, oh, yeah, that happened. And you learn from it. Okay, then all that is a point of reflection for me to integrate, to extract the knowledge from. That's a lesson for me to move forward. And it doesn't mean that I'm bad at it, or I'm not as good as I think I can be, or it's a reason for me to beat myself up for having fallen off. This is a path that all of us will be on forever.
People talk to me about the work-life balance. I reframe that into the work-life relationship. We need to have a relationship with our bodies. We need to have a relationship with our mind. If we are embodying anything, because embodiment means your cognition is able to process what your body is actually going through, what it's feeling, what it's aware of. How do you navigate the balance between surrendering to the flow of life and actively shaping your reality through conscious choices and intentions?
That is a great question. The first thing that came up for me was, I'll let you know when I figure it out. I feel like I just noticed when I'm at a space of, oh, I can tell I'm leaning too far in one direction, where I'm like trying to force what I want out of life to happen, where I can tell, oh, there's a lot of tension here. You don't need to be trying this hard. Then I'll intentionally work on, okay, how can I let go? How can I be okay with what's here now? There's also a space of, okay, but not much is happening when you've been there for a long time. I can take the reins a little bit more, that we don't need to be coasting all the time, just letting life happen to you and not being a cause in your own life isn't really a great extreme to be at either. For me, it's a balance of bouncing back and forth a little bit to try to find my center through that storm as best as possible. I don't have the best definitive of how to do it, other than just knowing myself well enough to know what it looks like when I'm hitting the boundaries of what feels like too far on either end for me. One of those being a lot of tension, that I notice I will get really fixated on things have to be a certain way. I notice if I get fixated on lists, for example, if I end up too far, I am living my life off of a list where everything is dictated by the 15-minute mark throughout my day, which I love structure. that feels really great for me to have structure. But when things aren't fitting into that structure, when life isn't letting everything be that structured, and I meet that with a lot of frustration and wanting
Mm-hmm.
to grind life into the format that I want it to fit in, is when I can tell, okay, this is not good for me. We have teetered a little bit too far into some territory I don't want to live in. The other extreme, it feels like for me, is trying to really clarify what it looks like to be on the other side of how much rest and leisure is too much for me, which is something that I'm playing with of like, where is that line of too much, where I need to start looking at what it looks like to be more of a cause? Where does that start getting invited in?
Mm.
So that's actually an area that I feel a little bit fuzzy in, is clarifying exactly what that looks like, because it definitely was my disposition for most of my early life to really live in rigidity. I've done a lot of work around unlearning and getting familiar with that. Once I started learning what it looked like to live on the other side of that pendulum swing, is now my work of what is too much of being over here look like, that I'm trying to flesh out for myself.
Mm. Yeah, it's really interesting because in my life I explored the extremes in order to try and find the midpoint in terms of experience. When I was younger, experiencing drinking, I needed to get drunk. What does it feel like to get really drunk? And what does it feel like to be really sober? Somewhere in the middle, it's like when you're on that seesaw and you don't find that midpoint. The midpoint is like your nervous system. If you go up and down on that seesaw, it wears away that central column that is your nervous system. Then it encodes it. It's shaping your agency unless you explore the relationship between those extremes. Because I was quite rigid and I could not surrender to the flow of life because I wanted to control it. I need to control this. I need to control that. But that's an illusion. We don't really control anything. Not really. So that's interesting in terms of surrendering to the flow. As you were talking about, it's an exploration. Distinction I would draw is you can be exploited by it or you can explore it. If you're
Hmm.
exploited by it, then you're triggered into reactivity based on a historical mechanism, which is repetitious slavery, as distinct from exploring new ways of self awareness, new ways of surrender, new ways of acquiescence to what that flow of life is. As we all strive to build a somatic foundation, what are some of the common pitfalls or challenges we may encounter along the way, and how can we overcome them?
Yeah, there's definitely a myriad of things you can encounter. You can spend a lot of time getting lost in and cycling, almost like dead ends. Like, it doesn't really benefit us to spend a lot of time in certain spaces. And we have a whole episode coming up dedicated to what some of those pitfalls can look like and working your way out of them. So we can get into a lot more detail, the specifics of what they can look like. But as a brief overview, some of the pitfalls people can find themselves in when exploring this work. The first one that I think is most common for a lot of people, that ties into what you were just sharing, the difference between being exploited and exploring, is self-judgment, which is something that I will continue to bring to the table as something worth looking at over and over, because it is sneaky, it happens all the time, and to me, it is the biggest roadblock that a lot of people face in making progress down this path, is judging themselves or having decided that certain parts of themselves, their psyche or their reactions or patterns of behavior, are bad, are weak, are worse than others, that end up getting met with frustration and resentment and this energy of, I just want this to change. If you're on this path, then obviously you notice that some of these things aren't serving you, and we don't want to put energy into things that aren't serving us. But staying in that space, that resentment, that judgment,
Mm.
will only persist and keep present those things you're looking to change. Because what melts away these patterns, from my perspective, it's all rooted in some sense of self feeling unsafe.
Yeah.
When we meet these parts that are feeling scared or vulnerable, that are only interested in keeping you alive and keeping you okay, and you're meeting them with judgment, there's no chance they're going to feel okay enough to back out of your life if you're meeting them with frustration and judgment. The only way these parts dissipate rather than being repressed is meeting them with love, self-compassion, understanding, and respect for the role they have played in serving you thus far. That helps them feel safe enough. I've done what I've needed to do. I can back off now. That is so important and can be something people get lost in, is once you start mapping out these different parts of self, is then having narratives about how we feel about these parts of self. And I have a teacher who says this all the time that I think is so brilliant, is parts of yourself that you are noticing yourself judging are so much more intelligent than the parts of you that are judging it. There is so much more survival intelligence rooted in the parts of self that have kept you alive, that helped you survive when you had no other resources, are so much more intelligent, so much more capable, so much more important than the part that is coming in to judge it and create these stories about how they are bad, weak, shouldn't be here, whatever. That's what feels really important for me to share, to reiterate, to drive home. That's the key to unlocking a lot of the potential of what this work has to offer.
We haven't really explored triggers and resilience in depth. Those were two other aspects of your work that I wanted to delve into, but we could extend that in the next episode because that's important in terms of when we make a practice of reflecting on our triggers, that can serve as a powerful gateway to self-awareness and emotional mastery. We can have a multi-dimensional approach rather than a rational approach, and we can shape our agency in a different. As we cultivate the habit, we can begin to notice that our awareness, our responses become much more quicker and more attuned because they allow us to recognize when we're being triggered in the moment. As you spoke about, we come back full circle when you drove into Honolulu. It's that heightened awareness provides us with the opportunity to pause and get curious and go, okay, let's take a step back. Let's be a compassionate witness. What is it about this situation or about this person that elicits this type of response from me? That's important in terms of the work that you do, and also the aspect about the whole issue of resilience, because resilience training is a transformative journey. And you spoke about the physical practices like cold plunges and yoga, and you're so right about yoga. My gosh, I could tell you stories about that. Pushed my body beyond my comfort zone, but that's where growth happens. They teach us a profound lesson. It's okay to experience discomfort and still be okay. By safely challenging ourselves in these ways, we can create a capacity in our nervous system to hold discomfort without triggering a sympathetic response. As you rightly said, that strengthens our vagal tone and promotes healthy regulation. Would you come back to talk about those things?
Absolutely. Happy to.
I've introduced a whole new thing called Soul Spotlight. This segment is about shining a light on the profound insights and wisdom that's been shared by you. If you could invite three fictional characters to join you for a yoga session, who would they be and why?
Oh man, three fictional characters. So this is a good question. I'm trying to reflect on fictional things to pull from for a yoga session. But yeah, the
Easy.
very first thing I have coming to mind, I'm a pretty big Harry Potter fan, so I have stuff from
Ah,
that's like coming in right now that I think, yeah, I feel like maybe Dumbledore wouldn't have been like the best person for yoga, but just somebody who has so much wisdom that just being in the energy of that wise elder energy is something that I really enjoy. That would be a lot of fun to have
hmm.
around. I would pick Dumbledore for one of them. Truthfully, I don't spend a ton of time in fiction. I watch a lot of documentaries, and I recently read a book about Winston Churchill's wife that I found really
Oh,
inspiring. Yeah, she's like a really cool lady who just was like behind the scenes, such an anchor for her husband, help him have the career that he did, but she was so active for him and with her own agenda that I found was so beautiful, that devotion that she had.
Well,
Um,
he wouldn't be able to do what he did without her.
Yeah, that's definitely what the book showed. How interesting it was that she was an emotional anchor for him, and the devotion she had to being that lifelong, almost like guardrails for him,
Mm.
being very subtle in how it helped him course correct for his personality that was a little outside the box and helping him be a little bit more digestible and received better, but also having her own agenda outside of him for going after the things she was really passionate about.
Mm.
I thought, especially for that time period too, huge fan of her. So she's been someone who's been on my mind recently. I feel really excited about. So yeah, getting to be around someone like that who really just challenged the
Mm.
status quo and went after living a life that was unconventional, but owning that and putting her whole heart into it is something that feels really
Interesting.
cool to me, very inspirational for me.
If you could design your own cold plunge experience with any theme or setting, what would it be and why?
Mm. Cool. Theme or setting. But yeah, the first thing that I have like visually coming to mind is doing the cold plunge in a tropical place, just having that kind of duality of the intense cold with the beautiful, lush warmness externally. I think duality and polarity are just really interesting things to practice witnessing in your life.
Mm.
That's the first thing that's coming up is that feels like something I would
Mm.
enjoy cultivating. So yeah, maybe actually and then having that be the theme of noticing the duality and polarity in life and kind of being in
Mm.
flow with always being in the middle of some form of that. I like that.
If you had to sum up the benefits of somatic healing in a single word, what would it be and why?
The benefits in a single
Yeah.
word, I can get it down to two words. It'd be
All
meeting
right.
God.
Say again.
Meeting God,
And
which
why would
is
you say that?
for me has been the pathway to relating to the wholeness outside of my sliver of consciousness, of tapping into the bigger picture and rooting my life into that certainty of that
Wow.
is how this is structured and that this is what I'm operating in. That has given me everything.
That's beautiful. I want to thank you so much because your insights, Ginny, on somatic exploration. I know we haven't spoken about resilience training in depth, but what we have spoken about today provides the platform to get a deeper penetration into things. And it's been truly illuminating for me. Thank you so much for coming on the show and also for giving your time at such an early hour of the day for partaking in these episodes and giving us your wisdom. Your expertise and guidance have really shed light on the transformative power within somatic exploration, which offers us invaluable tools for navigating life's challenges with proportion, grace, and resilience. So, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Peter. I can turn that compliment right back around. I really appreciate being given the space to dive into these more nuanced conversations. It really brings me alive to be able to dive into all of this.